I was going to say, yeah, studying is like wiping your ass, where it's like everybody's expected to you just do it on your own, right? And nobody helps you figure out whether you're doing it well.
Butterscotch.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 415 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the art person.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is May 12th, 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be swears on this show.
Yep.
And we'd also, they're coming. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your monthly donations to help keep this podcast going. All right, now we're just gonna get right into questions.
Let's go.
Because we got lots of things going on in the studio that we won't talk about now, but we'll talk about soon. After something happens.
Yeah. Things are going to happen.
Right.
And
at
then,
some point, something's going to happen.
And then we'll say some things about it. Things
not to spoil anything, but that's coming. So be ready.
Speaking of no spoilers, the new Zelda game came out.
Oh, yeah.
Comes out today.
Oh.
Or I guess last night at midnight or whatever.
What do we know about it? Do we know anything about
All
it?
I know is it's straight tens and hundreds across the board, basically, with a few little nitpicks here and there. So
I assume the 10s are out of 10.
yes.
Okay, perfect.
That's a good.
And the hundreds
Know
are
your
out of
metrics.
100 also. Those ones aren't out of 10.
Yeah.
Right.
The 5s
you never know.
Are out of 5. Also, they're not out of 10.
Yeah, you never know because nowadays
You don't see
nowadays,
fives
every
in like the console and PC space, you know, like that's always mostly out of 100 and then sometimes out of 10, right? But then on mobile, it's just like it's always out of 5. So
but then it's too chunky. So then they break it down into half stars. So it really still is out of 10, right?
That's true.
or out of really any number once it becomes.
Or I guess if you look at a game, it'd be like 4.7 out of 5. It's like what the fuck?
That's just 94 out of
that?
100. So
What are we doing?
What?
Yeah, and also we got the U-shaped review problem too of like, wow, this game has an average of like 60. Is it good? Well, most people say give it 100%, but then like a small number of people gave it 0 because I don't know, there was a person in it or something. So who the hell knows? But we'll see.
yeah, I do think Steam's thumbs up, thumbs down is just the best of the systems.
Yeah.
It's just
just a would you recommend it or would you not recommend it? But
Clean,
again, I think
simple.
our own invention of the nailed it / whiffed it
that's better.
is better because it's not about whether you would recommend it. It's whether you recognize what this game was trying to do and did they do a good job at it. It might
So
not
that
be
for the
you.
kind of person who would like a game like this. Would they like it? Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not you.
Because I don't care if you don't like it.
Yeah. I don't give a shit.
This isn't about you. You're writing a review for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Or I don't know why people write reviews. Anyways, let's get into the questions. So as a note, we started recording this episode, started answering the highest upvoted question, which came from Carl. My mic wasn't working, turned out, so we started over. So we're gonna put Carl's question on the shelf, and we'll get back to it next week.
Yeah.
Because we just spent some time talking about it, and we needed to let it rest now. So sorry, Carl. We'll get you next time. So the second highest upvoted question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from AttogourdieRakeishie, who says, I am hoping to become a solo developer, but I'm a student and don't have much free time. What is the best way to learn multiple skills, and how should I scale projects to be something I can accomplish?
Ooh. First question. When you say you don't have time.
Because as a student, this is when you have the most time.
This is the most time you'll ever have.
It usually is. So, but it might be
Depending.
the case that it is distributed in a way that feels like you don't have any, or
Yes.
that there are pockets where you don't have any. So for example, coming up on a finals week, it does feel like you got no fucking time because you got to be studying all the time or eating or sleeping. That's basically it, right? So the question is what is the shape of your lack of time? That's question number 1. Because if there's big holes in it where you usually don't have time, but then again, you're a student, so you probably got minimal responsibilities.
It comes in
outside your studies.
waves.
Yes. Then are there certain weekends where by shifting some things around, you could have the whole weekend? Because as a student, that's a
can do
thing
it.
that's very possible usually. That as an adult gets harder and harder to do, especially if they have family and stuff. So if that's the case, then game jams, as we've talked about before, I would always just say game jams, do game jams. If you want some skills in any place, do a game jam because you basically
they're
fit
good for
an entire
time
semester.
commitment.
Yeah, you have a semester of learning in 2 days, which is just amazing. So that's kind of that answer. If that's the shape of the problem for you.
Yeah, sprints are also a lot easier to manage because you don't have to figure out how to sustain them in the long term, and you don't have to figure out how to build habits around them, all that kind of stuff, right? So if you can find pockets where you can just throw a whole ass dedicated
or a
sprint,
day or whatever.
yeah, or even just a morning, you know, like if you like one of the ways that I always love to do things is I would just go to a coffee shop. This is pre-COVID days, right? But just like go to a coffee shop when I just needed to like do something, and then just plan to be there for like 4 hours drinking coffee and working on a problem of some sort.
Yes. And another nice thing about the jam approach is that the goal of the jam is to finish something, start and finish it in that time, which means you will be forced. Yeah, you'll be forced to keep the scope small. You'll be forced to think about things in a way that gets you to that goal. And when the weekend is done, then you have something that you can even, you know, show to your friends and have them play it, which is one of the most satisfying things. But if instead you say, oh, I'm just going to spend an hour a day working on this giant game project,
Which is what most people do, which you should not do.
yeah, then 3 years later, you still won't have something that somebody can play. And you'll be quite demotivated, and you're always trying to weave this thing into the cracks of your life.
Well, and every time you come back to it, basically the context of that thing gets bigger every time you touch it, right?
Yeah, it's harder and harder to work on over time.
Because if you're working on it, if you are actually working on it daily, like as a job, right, then that's fine. You're just like, you're familiar with the context. You just have to rebuild what you forgot over your sleep, right? And that's basically it. But if you're coming back to it regularly or once a week or on jam weekends here and there, or something like that, then you need to be able to just to come in and like work on your skills, basically, like learn new stuff. And you can't do that if you have to also like rebootstrap the context of the thing. And things get hard to work on even outside of that, because now you can't just go do something. You have to figure out, how does this work in the whole context of the thing? And the amount of progress you can make towards finishing something keeps on slowing down over time.
And even games that are like projects that that feel small when you are observing them from the outside. I think to me, it's like Stardew Valley is such a great example of this, because it was a game that when you look at it, you're like, oh, it's like a cute, like pixel art kind of farming game. And it's got like pretty straightforward systems and, you know, that.
Yeah, how hard could that be, mate?
Yeah, except like as you look deeper and deeper, you know, there's a lot of things going on under the hood, and it's under this kind of like retro, you know, veneer, like facade, where it feels like it's a very simple, small game, but it's not. It's incredibly deep, right? And that was one person that worked full time on it for 5 years.
Yep.
It's not like an hour a day. It was like that's all that he did, and he was like supported by his girlfriend, and there was like, you know. It's, you need to be able to chunk your time. And I'd also say if you're doing student stuff full time, then I wouldn't be thinking about this as your time to like try to make a big blockbuster. You know, it's your time to, like you were saying, you know, develop skills and build up that portfolio. And being able to just chunk out a weekend and do jams like that lets you get finished projects. It teaches you a lot about the entire beginning to end development process and the whole stack of everything. So yeah, that's, and like I'm speaking from my own experience. That was my journey as well. It's like I started working on a huge game for a year and it fell apart. And then I switched over to this make a game in 2 days, make a game in 3 days mode. And that was when things actually turned around for me, and I was able to like really ramp up my skills quickly. So
and that was how I learned programming, and is like it was back in 2008. You know, picked up my first. Well, I guess I tried to get into it a few times, right? But it was always in like weird school contexts, right? But really, like picked it up on my own for the first time and just tried to do it. And the reason I was able to stick with it was because I just kept on finding small one-off problems that I could go solve with, like, you know, in a rudimentary way at the time, but whatever, got the job done, so it doesn't matter, right? And I learned a bunch of stuff. And so, like, I was working as a lab tech at the time in a biology lab, and I would just notice, I'd be like, oh, hey, like there's this like tedious calculation I have to do every day. It's It's just a straightforward thing that has to happen, but I just have to like every fucking day, I have to come in and like measure this one kind of thing and then start from that measurement and then do a whole bunch of conversions and stuff, right? And I was like, oh, perfect. Let me just like write a little program that does this, you know? Like, and I spent a few hours in the evening like trying to figure that out because I didn't know anything, you know? Built a tiny ass little program, you know? And then over like the next few weeks, I just like made it a little better. So I had like a nice little prompt and it could like recover from errors, you know, and like that kind of like, but I didn't need to do that. That was just for fun to like figure out how I would do those things. And then I put that on the shelf, move on to the next one, you know, and like a new problem comes up. And I didn't try to like turn that into like, oh, hey, now I can build like an empire out of tooling for, you know, people to do delusion series or whatever. It was just like a one-off little project. And I kept on doing a series of those. Like anytime something would come up where I'd be like, I wonder if this is a programming challenge, you know, and I would like go try to figure it out. And I just did that for years, just years.
You basically
right?
you have to think on almost on an atomic level as you're, especially on the skill building phase. And the thing is like, it can seem like you shouldn't be doing that because the question is like, where is this building toward in terms of like, you're not building toward like a big game or whatever. But the reality is that it is way better early to be able to not have to deal with the shit that you did 2, 3, 4 weeks ago because it's so dumb and it is so poorly built that it is great to just wipe the slate clean and start over. So give yourself
the
that
idea
benefit
of a green field versus a brown field project, right? So, so in software, you'll hear this all the time. Green field means beautiful green pastures. Everything is great. It's green field, right? And that basically means you're starting fresh. Brown field means you're trying to do something in the context of existing things, right? And it's called brownfield. So it gets a very graphic representation. There's like pesticide everywhere. The land is poison, right? There's like there's like cow shit all over it, right? And you're trying to figure out how do I plant a tree here or something, right? And certainly as a student, when you're just like trying to learn stuff, brownfield is really, it's like, that's a really interesting problem domain. And that's actually where most problems live in the real world, right? Is like, it's in the context of other stuff that you have to deal with, but it's also a really, really hard place to learn.
Showing up when you don't actually know how to grow anything in one of those environments is not going to be
right, exactly. Yeah. If you come in there and you're like, well, I don't have any seeds. I've never heard of plants. I don't know what cows are. Right.
But apparently my first job is to de-pesticide this place or something. And by the time I'm done, I still haven't even started growing anything.
And I don't even know what pesticide is. Yeah. Like it just doesn't work. Right. There's way too much context that you need to build. It's the same idea we were saying earlier, that if you come back to projects infrequently, the context building you have to do is that's your own brownfield project that you've created now. Right. And so tech debt is the other name for this, right? So being able to do things in a way that you can kind of just throw it away is the learning strategy. That's how you figure out how to do stuff.
Yeah. And I do want to touch back on the idea of not having time, because it's one of those things that is generally not true. And I don't mean that in the sense where it's like, it doesn't, I'm fully on board with being able to feel like you don't have time. Most people feel like that. I feel like that a lot. But when
the fact is you don't, because you have the time that you have and you haven't changed it.
Yeah, there's infinite things to do though, right? There's always there's an infinite laundry list of things, both that you are required to do, maybe for school, as well as things that you maybe think you're required to do, and then things that you would just like to do, you know. And if you
there are different also ways to do each of those things.
Yes, this is kind of what we're getting at, which is like if there's things that are taking up, basically the question first is what is taking up your time actually? And that's a really good exercise to do, which is like keeping a time journal and just for a week, just every day, just keep track of, as you switch between activities and stuff, what you're doing. Guarantee you, somehow you will suddenly realize that you actually have probably like a good 2 hours every day, really, where you could like do something with, if not more. Then with the things that are on that list, you ask a second question, which is, okay, let's say I'm spending like 4 hours a day studying for this, I don't know, chemistry class or whatever. There's a different question there, which is not, it's not about like cutting it out because you can't, but it's about saying, how do I do this in a way that doesn't take so much fucking time? How do I get better at this thing in service of freeing up time so that I can do this other thing? Because the reality is a lot of times, if you just start making these cuts where you're like, well, I'm just going to spend 3 hours studying now because I need more time to do this other thing, but you don't change the method, you're just sort of going to start losing in both domains actually, because you're not necessarily more effectively doing the work. that you need to be doing. So I think that's the other piece, which is once you actually know what you are doing, then you have to ask the question, am I actually doing this well? Really? When it comes out like efficiently? And if your answer off the cuff is like, oh yeah, no, I know how to study, you don't. I guarantee you.
Definitely don't.
Even with the stuff we do with, with art, whatever else, always, I'm looking for new ways to do the things that I do. Every single week I spend probably at least an hour looking at other artists' tutorials or, reading through the newsletter I get from Clip Studio Paint about like weird functions that they have that I might know about, might not, but there's better ways to do every single thing you're doing. Doesn't mean you're doing things poorly or wrong. I'm just saying that's sort of generally the case. And some of them are so huge in terms of the impact that you can take something like a 4-hour study session and reduce it down to like 2 hours and get better results too. And so that's the thing where it's like, you got to look at the stuff that you are doing.
You got to take required to do. Focus.
Yeah. And ask, how do I do this well? And not come at it from I already know what I'm doing, but just ask.
This is actually exactly what I ran into. Where when I was when I started law school, that was also the time when I started learning how to make games, and I was kind of pissed off because like I found Game Maker and I was like, oh, I actually could use this to make games, but my law school classes were demanding just an insane amount of time to like read all these cases and prepare these outlines and study and stuff. And I was kind of I was chafing up against the fact that like I wanted to be putting my time into my game dev, but I supposedly had to put, 30 hours a week outside of class studying. And I got that idea that that's how much time it was going to take is because that's how much time my classmates were spending studying. And it wasn't until that like suddenly like something clicked at that moment where I was like, wait a minute, how do you study?
Yep. Does it have to take 30 hours? Or
because when I was
causing it to take 30 hours?
We were never taught how to do.
You were never taught
to study.
Insane. Yeah. We spent
kind
our
of like
whole
the debate.
fucking lives as like from children until we were adults in school. And there was not a moment where somebody sat down and was like, let's talk about how to do this, how to do school actually.
Yeah. And so I started doing a bunch of experiments to find ways to sort of like isolate the things that I was struggling with and separate that out from the things that I understood well, right? Because I think a lot of the problems with studying is it comes down to like just reviewing notes, right? And like going through a whole bunch of stuff that you've already seen, as opposed to a more targeted approach where you can like specifically focus on the stuff that you just need to be focusing on and don't worry about the stuff that you're already good in. And once I sort of like came up with a strategy to handle that, then my study time dropped by about 80%. Like I was taking about a fifth as much time to study because I was just studying just specifically the things that I needed to study and just ignoring the rest. And I did great. My grades were good. I was like, this is the first time that I actually like thought about studying. But then at the same time, I was spending 20 plus hours a week just working on learning how to make video games then instead. So yeah, I mean, I've been in this exact situation, and yeah, what Sam's saying is right. It's that like you don't currently have free time, but that's just a consequence of the way that you're currently doing things, and it's.
But also, there's no such
to look
thing
at those things
because time just passes, right? So like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, nobody has free
time. Time is just a thing that happens to you, right? It's not free because like something happened, in that.
Yeah, nobody has just like a 3-hour chunk of every day where they're just like, wow, I'm just not doing anything at all.
Yeah.
And the thing is like
just time won't pass unless I think of something to do. Like, no, it's just happening.
And you may have, for example, like a 3-hour chunk or not even a chunk, but just 3 hours throughout the day where you're like watching YouTube videos or TikTok or
check
whatever.
your screen time on your phone. Just tell me how much time you got on that.
It's a lot more than you think.
Yeah. And the thing is like from the outside, it looks like you're doing nothing, but that actually is like your brain is like occupied at that time and you are filling that time.
Yeah. There's no such thing as doing nothing. Again, something had to have happened because time passed, right? So like whatever it was.
Yeah. So I think it's step one is just like get a picture of where your time's actually going. And step two, like Sam was saying, is look at
the big chunks and say, how do I make that a small chunk?
How do I get the same or better results with a lot less effort?
Yeah. Well, and then to Seth's point too, it's just literally true of everything that we're not taught how to do anything actually in a way that is geared towards like scalability and efficiency, right? mostly you just have to kind of figure things out on your own because that's just how we operate, I guess. And so you kind of like so everybody has their own ways of doing everything. And you don't even realize that you have your own way of doing literally everything, right? And all
Ask
of
two
that
different
stuff,
people how they load a dishwasher, and you'll see fights break out. It's fucking
yeah.
hilarious.
Oh yeah, or like stuff that like really feels like it shouldn't be different. Like every once in a while, I'll see a video or something where somebody and they're talking to somebody else and they realize that like they wipe their ass in a different way, right?
I was gonna say, yeah, studying is like wiping your ass,
Yeah,
where it's like everybody's
everybody is
expected
doing it the
to
same.
you just do it on your own, right?
Yeah.
And nobody helps you figure out whether you're doing it well.
and literally everything in life is like this, right? And it's not until you are confronted with the fact that, because basically scalability is like really what this problem is about, right? Of the stuff that you do. And scalability, the idea there is to say something we don't, and the reason I focus on scalability, not on actual scaling, is because until sort of demand rises and breaks your current system, right? You don't think about scalability on it for a given thing, right? But it's the fact that you don't that allows you to do all these things and just like have all of your time just be filled with stuff in a way that it doesn't need to be. And that's not inherently bad either, right? Like there's the kind of like efficiency bro mindset where you're just like, I need to make sure that every moment of my time is used as efficiently as possible, whatever, right? That's actually not a thing you have to. Yeah, I've been there. We've all been there. It's part of learning and growing as a human being, I think, is getting into and then past that phase, right? But it's basically deciding what to do with your time and why you're doing stuff, right? Along with the realization that the stuff that you are doing is like it's arbitrary. It's stuff that you choose, and you won't be doing it in a way inherently that is scalable. That doesn't mean you have to be, but if you're trying to find other ways if you're trying to find stuff to add, then the only way to do that is by identifying what you're doing and how you're doing it, and then deciding what do I not do, and of the stuff that's left, how do I still get out of it what I want, but maybe using a more scalable approach?
What I will say that I think there's a problem. There's a very modern day problem, I think, with the mindset toward just like work or studying, which is this big glorification of hardness, studying hard, working hard, right? And I mean, again, I've been there. Was like, yeah, I just need to rise some grind, get those hours in. Let's go.
Get that grind mindset.
Yeah, when people are like, it's just going to take 10,000 hours of terrible drawing before your drawings are good. Does it have to?
It does.
No, it fucking does not. And the thing is, like, if you can stop, like in a lot of ways, you subconsciously, if you're working really hard, it feels like you're doing things correctly.
Yeah,
because you're exerting a lot of effort. And this is a problem because ideally, studying should be easy. Should be very easy. But it doesn't sound good, really, to say like, "Oh, I barely studied for this."
Well, it's braggy.
It's
right?
braggy.
Like,
and so
it's not braggy to say that you worked hard for some reason, but it is braggy to say that you worked smart. I think because people attribute hard work as like something anybody can do, but working smart is something only smart people can do.
Yes.
Which
it's actually backwards.
It's not
because working hard at something like means basically surmounting. It basically means using your willpower, right?
Yes.
And like surmounting obstacles by sheer brute force, and that's actually one of the hardest ways to do anything, right?
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah,
it's like actually hard. It just right. But that isn't what we should be celebrating, though, because not only is that inaccessible actually to lots of people lots of the time, but it's not a good way to do it. Yeah. It's bad for you. It's bad for your health. It's bad for everything. Yeah. It's not fun. You're not having a good time.
Yeah, I mean, we had a market shift in the studio when we started asking the question, like, how do we get as much done and just not do it in a way that is hard? Can we just fucking not? Yeah. I would like to coast.
Well, that was our DevOps thing where we said, like, what if we said time is a constraint, not a resource that we can just keep spending more of to solve problems? It's like, all right, if we work 35 hours a week on our games, then we have to make sure. Yeah, we got to make sure that those 35 hours are great and easy, and that we just
moving us towards the outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, and so and like things take a long time.
Sure.
Just because like if you're making a giant thing, right? It just
takes a minute.
Takes time, right? But like we're also trying to find ways to make it faster all the time. But just because something takes a while doesn't mean that it should be excruciatingly difficult. And I think like a good example is like farming, which I think we can all agree is hard as fuck. right?
Yeah.
However, it used to be way harder, right? Because you could only farm like a little bit of land, and you had you didn't have much in the way of fertilizers, so your crops just kind of like died a lot, and they were hard to grow, and like you had to use like animals to plow stuff, or like. And nowadays we have all this machinery, and like, yeah, there's still plenty of different kinds of plants or crops that do have to be, hand harvested and stuff like, and people are trying to solve those with like robotics and stuff because if you've got like two farmers, and one of them is bragging about how they're working 10 times harder than the other farmers, but while yielding 1/10 of the crops, right?
Yeah. That's a good. It's a very good metaphor actually, because it's kind of that same thing where it's like whenever someone tells me they're working really hard, I am deeply suspicious of their method they're using to get the work done.
Yeah, it's just like why?
Yeah,
why
are you
just
working so? And not in a way that's like that is saying that you are bad or like doing it wrong, but just saying like, why is this so hard? Could we make it
and you're
fun?
using the wrong metric, right? Because if that's the thing that you're talking about is like how much time is going in and how hard it was for you to put that time in, right? You're just using the wrong metrics to decide like if this.
I think what happened was it was after school when you enter the workforce, when suddenly no one gives a shit about you. They just want what happens because of your efforts. They don't care they don't care if you sacrificed yourself and your family to get those fucking, I don't know, PowerPoint decks put together or like
They want you to actually.
It depends, right? Because like in some places they actually can't really figure out what you do or how to measure it. And so the only metric they use is how much did you sacrifice for the company? Did you work overtime? Did you not take any vacation?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you're looking at like maybe if you're talking about like direct within a corporation, someone
like an
looking at you.
office job.
Yeah, but I'm saying like as far as like a product development goes, maybe it's a better example of this because like in the video game space, right? It is very possible to take 2, 4, 6 times longer to make something that has 10 times more bugs that is a 10th the size that it could. Like it can be much easier for someone to make a product that does way better than you did, and no one cares that it was easy for that person, or you don't get rewarded for the hardness. So do not glorify
working hard by default gives you worse outcomes.
Yes. Yeah. So just I hope you get ahead of it earlier than I did, but just like try to drop the notion that it's somehow giving you something for things to be hard, because as soon as you can like actually kind of jettison that a little bit, then you get curious about how to make things not hard, and that's where everything starts opening up for scale.
That's also where you learn, because like you can't make a thing not hard if you don't understand it. It's just not possible. So that's where like at this point, most of my like waking time at work isn't. Even when I am like really actively working on something, still most of my mental time is like going into all the, what are the implications of this? Like, how can I make this suck less? There's so many things. Like I originally learned programming because I thought it would be like fun to help me problem solve, but that was it. Right. But that was then truth. It's like this long-term approach of like, how do I just make all problems easier somehow? Right. And yeah, learning programming is not an easy way to approach that. Right. But there are harder and easier ways of learning programming too. Right. It just keeps on getting nested lower and lower. Right. And so most of the stuff that I do these days is like figuring out how do I just make stuff easier and better for myself in the long term, while still having a decent time now. Right. And that's the mindset that lets you just like figure out how to do the stuff that you want to do eventually.
Now, as a final note about this idea of like re-examining stuff that you think you've got a handle on, but it turns out you haven't really thought about it probably at all. So in the studio, we've been doing a little bit of an ergonomics push. And we have picked up these new Moonlander keyboards.
From what's the company?
ZSA.
ZSA?
Yeah. So if you go to, I think it's ZSA.io.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah. So they make a keyboard called the Ergo Docs, right? They make Ergo Docs.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the idea is like it's a split keyboard that has highly reconfigurable keys and some additional sort of like thumb buttons, and it's very flexible in terms of how you can remap it and how you can sort of like tilt it around and, make it fit your ergonomic situation. But it doesn't have as many keys as a normal keyboard does because it has a layers system where you can hit a button and flip into a new layer, and then you've got an entirely new set of key mappings. So instead of having a dedicated chunk of the keyboard, for example, that's a numpad, you can just hit a button to flip into a different layer, and then
now
you've got
you're
a section of your
numpad mode.
keyboard.
Yeah.
Right. And this has been an interesting transition because when you don't quite have as many keys freely available, then you've got to think about what keys you do use a lot and when and under what circumstances, which keys you never use or you think you never use. And you kind of got to come up with your own like keyboard mapping of all this. And it's been a very wild and interesting week to kind of see each different person who's playing around with this keyboard working on because we can share our layouts with each other. Right. And like Adam and I both do a lot of programming. So our layouts have some things, some ideas in common, but almost none of the actual key placements are the same. Yeah. And then Sam is doing a lot of like one hand on the left portion of the keyboard while drawing with his right hand, and what keys he needs and key combos and stuff are also, totally different. But as we've been working on this stuff throughout the week, we just keep comparing notes of like realizing all these things that we've been doing with our hands while typing for decades that we just never really knew that we were doing.
Yeah. Or even like shit that you've been doing that because you couldn't change it because of the circumstance, you haven't been able to take advantage of. So the easiest one for me is the delete and backspace key problem, which is that those two keys do different things in a lot of art programs, from like blowing up a layer, for example, versus not even doing anything. But you cannot map both of them. In other words, like the delete key, the actual del key, at least in Clip Studio Paint, I cannot map to the thing I need to map it to, right? Which means I cannot get it onto my left fucking hand, which means every time I need to press that key, which is, relatively frequently, I have to go press it over, like to go over there and press it.
Yeah. So you got like reach across.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's weird shit like that where you suddenly, I could put it on my thumb and it's like, you could feel it where suddenly you're like, this means, and then it's sort of like, because it cascades out. Like you could just feel how important those little stupid shifts are. And it's like, there are things that you are structurally not able to do because you don't have the tools that would allow you to do so, right? In this particular case. But then also the cost of like doing all this thought work and these changes is pretty fucking big. And like, I can't hardly type on my Moonlander yet. I've only spent like 15 minutes. Like,
I spent hours over this past weekend because I got it on last Friday, and I just spent hours like trying out new mappings and then doing some like practice runs to be like, oh, this part sucks, right? Swapping out keys because the keys didn't feel good, like hours. And then also this week, more hours, just like thinking about being like, oh, okay, this isn't quite right. Like trying to come up with like a theoretical underpinning of like how my keyboard should work, right? Because normally you're just, Sam, like you're saying, it's like time, right? You're normally just handed a QWERTY keyboard. Yeah, you're like, okay, this is what a keyboard is, right? So like it has enough keys to have literally everything on it, and everything is built with a QWERTY keyboard in mind, right? So like if it's doable in the thing, like there's a way to do it on the keyboard, right? And we've spent decades learning using software that assumes we're using a QWERTY keyboard and then using QWERTY keyboards, right? But just the idea that like the default behavior is like my hand knows if I want to move arrow keys around, it just has to fucking move some. Like my whole ass hand just has to move like 5 inches like to where the arrow keys are going to be. Right? Like that's normal behavior and I'm used to it, right? So like that to me is like, that's okay. That's how this works. That's what good is. That's what the default is, right? Yep. And yeah, then now given this new system where it's like, that doesn't have to be how it is though, right? It can be, and in fact can't be because there aren't just dedicated arrow keys. So now it's like, now I also have to figure out how do I actually do this differently instead? And it's stuff like because programming is different than writing prose. It's so different. The keys that you need, like I need to hit plus and equals constantly, and hit dash underscore constantly.
All the symbols.
You need all the symbols all the time, and you're hitting brackets all the time, right? And so that was like one of the interesting things was like, how do I find a way on this new layout to like take those kinds of keys that I actually do need all the time that they've kind of stripped out before they normally are, or just like move them to different layers or something, right? But make them actually really easy to hit, because now that all of a sudden I don't have those keys anymore, but also could have them anywhere, any way that I want to, then I have this like new struggle of I'm going to have to relearn something. That's the hard part, right? Yes. But the thing that I get to learn now is something new that makes programming better and easier in the long term, right? And actually all problems are like this, like that's what we're talking about, right? Like everything is this thing is like, if once you identify what the defaults are and realize those are all made up, and then embrace the idea that like to move into some new domain, I have to go through the discomfort of like learning and adapting, right? And thinking really hard and working on something, like and figuring out actually what changes to make. Like that's the part that actually is hard. That's the part that should be hard, is the careful thinking and experimenting and trying to change stuff as you find a new approach. And it's the willingness to do that basically, and to constantly be doing that is what allows you to be like, oh, now I'm a solo dev who builds entire video games or whatever, right? You can't do it without that kind of approach to everything.
Yeah. Well, there's
or you
also
can't. It'll just be really hard all the time.
Yeah. And there's also a hump to that of like, once you start really thinking about these things that you haven't thought about before, there's like a moment at first where you're just like, oh, finally, I get to like be the mastermind I was always meant to be, you know? And like, for example, the fact that like that on a normal QWERTY keyboard, your pinky rests on the semicolon, right? Which is like, if you're writing normal prose, that's fucking weird.
Yeah.
Right?
You
like
never hit that fucking button. It's like yeah. Why?
Yeah. And then like you got like reach to hit the period, right? With like a normal QWERTY keyboard, which again, like why is that like that, right? But then there's like all of these knock-on effects where maybe you do decide I'm gonna be a genius badass. I'm gonna swap these two. But then it turns out that like the relationship of those two keys was actually really important, right? Because they're in a certain position because of some other keys. Yep. And then you start moving some other things around, and then you end up with like a completely different layout, and then it doesn't work at all. And then you kind of work your way backwards and end up pretty close to where you started. Right?
Which describes my journey with this keyboard so far. Like,
that's usually how it goes.
Yeah,
I departed substantially from QWERTY at first to be like, oh, it makes so much more sense. And actually a lot of it I think was still true. It's just that I then added so much additional learning that I would have to do.
Yeah, it might make sense in a vacuum.
Yeah, but things don't live in a vacuum. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's all this stuff too that like when you first start, so like if you're trying to like redo how you study or whatever, like you're going to come up with all kinds of wild ideas and change lots of things at once. And a lot of it's not going to work. And then it's going to take a lot of time. And it's going to be kind of discouraging, but like it's all part of the process of in the long run, getting smarter and better at things. Yeah. You've got to make the mistakes, but at least you're doing something. At least you're changing something.
Yeah, if you get really good at having the outcomes you're looking for be the side effects of your process improvement work.
Yes.
Right? So that you do well on tests because you've gotten really good and you've like basically done R&D about studying, right? And figuring out how to study and how to take tests, right? Because then the side effect is now all of a sudden you can now go to any class and take any class and you could take any test. So like now all of a sudden everything is fine, right? And if you can figure that out, but that's its own thing, that's its own discipline, which is I just think of as like R&D, right? And as you guys are saying, it's frustrating as fuck. Like your ideas won't pan out. It's R&D, right? Like it's one of the things that the best things I got out of going to grad school and like trying to do science, right, with scientists who are actually like publishing, novel research and stuff, right, is the discovery that almost everything you do doesn't work out.
Yep.
Almost all of it.
Almost everything.
And even the stuff that seems to have worked out, you look back on 5 or 10 years later and you're like, oh, it turned out that was still wrong, actually, right? We just didn't have enough information at the time to know that. And it was like the embrace of that lifestyle of just being like, yeah, you just learn as much as you can and you stay curious and you just like every source of information you can, you just like hear what people are talking about. You like try things that people claim that are possible, right? Mm-hmm. And over time, you just start to like the failure process of R&D just becomes part of the process. I spend most of my time just thinking about stuff and trying things, and like most of any given day is like, I wonder if, and then being like, nope, turns out, right? And like that's actually still like even today, that's still most of what I do is just like try a thing that doesn't work out, and I just love it at this point, right? But I didn't at first. At first it was
that's not
very frustrating. It's not fun. And I think if you can get yourself into that position of just being like, yeah, I just love trying stuff and it's fun when things don't go wrong because I learned something still. Like that's
I think part of it though comes from easing up a bit on the timing of some of these wants. What I mean by that is, if you're a student and you don't have time because you're studying so much, arguably, then the thing you should be doing maybe is not figuring out how to be a solo dev, but it should be figuring out how to just be a student.
Yeah,
how to make it easy to be a student.
So,
because now as a side effect, you could then figure out, how do I become a solo dev? Right?
Yeah, that'll come actually after that without a lot less trouble. And so bucket this stuff a little bit. I mean, you literally say like, okay, for this next 6 weeks, my free time, I'm going to actually dunk into this problem of studying. Like, don't worry about the thing that you actually are being ambitious about. And this was the weirdest part for me about getting a bit older, which is the connectedness of things that you're not thinking are building your way toward that future that you're trying to get to, right? And it's like, if you really allow yourself to relax on some of these big ambitious things for a moment and focus on some pretty like nitty gritty, down to earth, like how to be doing the thing you are currently required to do, weirdly enough, it can and may actually end up speeding up your ability to get to that ambitious point, and you'll be able to get there in a way that you're happier and just enjoying yourself a bit better with. So like, you don't have to be a solo dev while being a student, but you do have to be a student. So get that shit on lock.
I think
that's actually
I think that's a really important point, because it does, like, the interconnectedness of everything is there, right? Because like, if you're thinking about even about your social life, right? Whether you have a significant other, whether you're in school, you just have a bunch of friends, whatever it is, right? You have, like, we also aren't taught how to live in a social context either, right? That's something that you figure out,
sort of absorb it.
In the chaos of being socially punished if you step out of line, right? Growing up. But there's not like an active process by which you're taught, like, oh, here's how you have healthy relationships. Here's how you deal with like setting boundaries. Here's how to date without being a creep, right? Like, I'm speaking for dudes in particular, because I didn't know how to do that without being a creep. And so like there's all this stuff that you don't know, but all of that, as Sam was saying, like it bleeds in, right? Yeah. Because I'm even thinking about my own, like my social life with my wife now, like in adulthood, we've been married for 15 almost actually 16 years this year, right? Mm-hmm. So we've been together for a long time, but it still is the case that every year we're like, we find something and we're like, oh, we didn't realize this was going on. And now that we've addressed that, like our lives became easier. And now all of a sudden, again, like my time shifted, like where my time is going shifted, right? What time I'm available to do stuff and what my mindset is like when I'm doing that, right? Because if you have a period of time where like you and your significant other or friends are not getting along really well, or there's just some kind of tension, and I think because of how we're all raised, like the reality is that even if you think everything is fine, there's just tension you haven't consciously addressed yet, because you're just like flying by the seat of your pants, and it just thinking it's a scalability problem, right? It hasn't reached a point where it now is a problem, right? And this is true about everything in your life. You just like, once you start to like dig into it, and once those are addressed and improved, now all of a sudden, like a whole bunch of concerns go away. You're less anxious, your brain works better, right? Like all these other things happen. And then again, as a side effect, it becomes easier to go pursue some other project. So I think, Sam, like your point of like, you are a student right now. That's like what you have to do. Yeah. And this is actually, but if you think about all the aspects of your life of like, you're also like potentially a sibling, potentially a child, potentially a parent. There's a whole bunch of things that you just are, right? And if you really figure those things out, like get really good at those things, right? As a side effect, all of a sudden the other things that you want to do also become more doable.
Yeah, well, because now you're turning yourself into a person who is good at getting good at things, which is
that's the actual thing.
That's the thing you can be.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of when we were working on the game changer stuff, and I was speaking with somebody about like what our plans were in publishing and all that. And for those who haven't heard of our podcast, Game Changer is our internal tool for adding content to Crashlands 2, which was a 6-month project. So we suspended Crashlands 2 for 6 months to develop this Game Changer, and it has paid off like 1,000 times over. But when I was talking to somebody about it when we were kind of in the middle of it, they said, well, are you like, since you're stopping development for 6 months to work on this tool, are you going to have to like postpone your launch? And I was like, what? no, like the reason we're making this tool is so that we can hit the launch. Like the reason we're stopping development for 6 months is so we can hit our launch target.
Yeah, it was because the way we were doing development wasn't scalable.
Wasn't going to get us.
It wasn't going to get us.
It was hard.
Yeah, it was way
hard.
too hard, and we were tired of it being hard, But it's like, have you guys seen that clip from Malcolm in the Middle where it's just like this sequence? You guys know that show, Malcolm in the Middle, with Bryan Cranston as Hal, the dad?
Yeah, we grew up with that one. But I don't think we watched it like all of it, but we definitely watched it a fair bit.
No, but it has some great moments. Like there's this one scene where Hal, he comes into, like he notices there's like a light bulb out. And so he like gets out, he unscrews it, and then he goes in the garage to like get a new light bulb, and then like he opens a drawer to like where I guess the other light bulbs are, and the drawer squeaks, right? And then he sees that and he's like, what? And he starts moving the drawer, hearing the squeaks. And then he goes to find like some WD-40. And then like when he goes to get WD-40, he notices that like the shelf that the WD-40 is on is kind of like uneven, right? And wobbly. And so then basically he ends up like roaming around the house, just like starting to fix a variety of problems. And then by the time like several hours later, his wife comes home and he's now underneath the car, like fixing something under the car. And the wife is like, hey, I thought I asked you to change that light bulb. And he's like, what does it look like I'm doing? Yeah. And it's like, yeah, sometimes you take a very indirect path, to get to where you're trying to go. But as long as you're solving problems, along the way and trying to make things better, then, you'll get there. It's okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for this week. So, one question, pretty good, you guys. We did it. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa Acosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators to keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.